I want to talk about something meta in the COVID narrative, and that's whether or not platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter should censor scientific information or scientific discussion. This has become a thorny issue. This is an issue that divides many people. This is an issue that attitudes in my own group of people, which are biomedical scientists, is quite divided. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues here. The first thing I have to say is I have to admit that in the time I've been in biomedicine, attitudes on this issue have changed dramatically. I remember starting medical school in 2005, and I will promise you back then, the appetite to censor opinions we disagree with, even opinions we thought would lead to harmful actions, that appetite was very low. We didn't really think that was an acceptable course of action. There were spirited debates around issues like mammography and PSA screening, and both sides thought the other side was harming or killing or hurting or maiming the other many healthy people. If you thought mammography shouldn't be done, you thought it was a detriment to those women, you thought the other side was hurting them, and vice versa. If you thought mammography should be done, was life-saving, you thought the other side was hurting them. But there was never this appetite to say, because that could be a harmful view, we need to expunge it from the record. You wanted to rebut them, you wanted to correct them, you wanted to maybe even drown them out, but you didn't want to remove their words from the world. I think that's a novel concept. But it has emerged in this pandemic, this idea whether or not we ought to censor, when should we censor? And I do think there is some reason why this might be a little bit different. The decisions we're making right now, the magnitude and stake of those decisions, the beliefs we hold, they have implications not only for our own lives, but the lives of many other people. If we're wrong about something, if we promote a wrong narrative, we can hurt many thousands of people, maybe even millions of people. So that, I think, is like the prima facie reason why we ought to consider this differently. But I think there's some challenges when it comes to these kinds of platform censoring, and I want to walk you through those challenges. One challenge. As you do science, you learn a lot of things. You learn, first off, how to read science. How do you read it? And then as you get better at it, how do you read it more clearly? How do you really tease apart science that is true and useful from science that is noise and part of that endless chasing of CV? Then you start doing science and you start publishing science. And you learn a lot of things. You learn, how do you write an abstract? How do you write a paper? How do you format a paper? How do you think about a scientific thought? How do you present your research findings? How do you probe a question? What questions are worth probing? Many, many such things I talk to a lot about with my team of researchers. And then the last thing, the toughest thing about science that only comes with a lot of experience and a lot of time in the field is what kind of debates are acceptable? What kind of views are within the canon of reasonable discourse? What should an editor have as a pro-con piece? And what debates are so nonsensical that one side really doesn't have standing? And that comes with a lot of experience and a lot of time. And I think reasonable people can disagree about that. But I don't think anyone just entering the scientific field can immediately have the right answer on that in all the cases. And I think reasonable people will legitimately disagree. Why do I say that? When it comes to censoring points of view or censoring ideas, I think you're in that last tier. You're in the toughest tier of science there is. Having experience, having done papers, having published, being a PhD student, being an MD student, that's just not enough to really know what that arena is like. Have you lived long enough in science where you've seen debates topple, where you've seen that mammographic debate? And I've seen it from 2005 to the present day. In 2005, to even suggest that there may be women who suffer from overdiagnosis, that was a very heretical thought. There were a lot of people who were against some of the popular proponents of that, like Barry Kramer, like Gil Welsh. They argued against them vehemently. Now, of course, those ideas are very much mainstream in biomedicine. It is the norm to think there's overdiagnosis, and proponents believe that the net benefit of mammography outweighs that. But I think that ability to have that dialogue is a lot different than it was. I've lived through these debates on Human Genome Project, on cancer screening, on cancer drugs, so many of these debates. And I've seen the arc by which ideas that were once thought to be deviations from what you ought to think later become the obvious idea that everyone should have thought about all along. The same person who said, genome drugs benefit most cancer patients, after a debate where we show that it in fact benefits the minority of cancer patients, they act as if they believe that all along. That's an easy way to save your ego in the face of evidence that runs contrary to views. And it's a common thing that happens in science over many, many years. What does this have to do with censoring? I think we have to be honest that the people who are calling for the censoring, the people who are doing the censoring, they're not the people who have spent long enough time in the scientific business to know what debates you ought to let go and what debates you might want to curtail. They don't have that sort of long arc, that experience on these issues. They often are very junior people who are hired by these technology companies who mean well, whose heart's in the right place, who may be activists on a number of social political issues, but who really don't have that experience to know where do you draw the line. I admit, I listen to things and I hear things that I think are just totally wrong and false. And it's easy to point to things that are totally wrong and false. What is hard is to draw the line between what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And that's what censoring has to do. It has to draw the line. And there are these huge reports out by the Surgeon General about censoring. You can read that whole report, and the one thing you won't find is a robust definition of what is censoring, of what is misinformation, of where is the line between reasonable dialogue and reasonable debate, and it's gone too far. They can't enunciate that line. That line is very difficult. It's unlikely that 10 people will have the same line, even 10 very experienced people. The next thing that concerns me, many of the people who see themselves as the misinformation police, they really just have a point of view that is an entrenched, scientific, science-y point of view that kind of dovetails with politics. They have a certain politics, they have a certain point of view. They talk about it a lot on social media. They believe they are the agents of good, that they are the ones who can police the misinformation, but they themselves so easily succumb to viral clickbait articles that are just patently untrue. They so easily succumb to rumors about others that are just incorrect or false. They themselves show a vulnerability to misinformation, and these are the people who are most ardent about policing misinformation. There's also the double standard. Observational studies are not really good at assessing causality, but the same person who would say that these observational studies, they don't prove ivermectin works, and by the way, I agree, they do not, and I've said many times I don't advise that off protocol. I advise it to be done on randomized studies. But they'll happily accept those observational studies if they prove, quote unquote, that masks work in very young kids in daycare and in elementary schools. But it has the same flaw in both examples. They're not having a consistent evidence framework. So what am I to think when these agents are vociferous and passionate about censoring without being able to demarcate what is acceptable dialogue and acceptable debate versus unacceptable debate? I think it is an internally inconsistent position. It is a position that's easy to hold if you yourself find yourself in the majority mob, but is a position that you will quickly relinquish when you find yourself outside that majority position. It's a position you will quickly relinquish when you think about the broad arc of scientific discussions and debates. When you think about all those debates that we needed to have, that really shifted points of view, that people in retrospect don't even see that. You only know it if you lived it. When you see that, you recognize that having a broad forum for scientific debate is probably the best idea. And Facebook and Twitter and these kinds of companies, they're not really positioned to do this kind of refereeing. Universities are better positioned, and they do it to some degree through the elaborate process by which they hire faculty and decide who to promote and who to keep. They do it to some degree in terms of the conferences they hold and don't hold. But even they are very careful to amplify some things and not curtail other things. But I will argue that actually they have done a disservice, and if anything, have been too close-minded and are increasingly capitulating to the social media mentality. This is a thorny issue, but I will go further and I will argue that I think that the worst entity to do it would be for these tech companies to hire people just out of PhD or postdoc who didn't get faculty positions, who didn't get other opportunities, and ask them to referee these debates. I don't think they're well positioned to do it. I don't think they're the ideal demographic. Would it be better if they just recruited the deans of universities from the past? Perhaps. But I suspect in that age group, with people with that experience, their attitude towards censorship will be different than the attitude among the young. I'm a little troubled that this attitude has shifted so dramatically. To me, science has always meant trying to build the case for your point of view, going with the evidence where the evidence takes you, and if the evidence refutes your point of view, refining your position. But that is difficult in a world where we have to always say the quote-unquote right policy prescription from day one. That's untenable. It is natural, it is inevitable that when you have policy prescriptions that you've never had in 1,000 years, like shutting down the world, that reasonable and smart people are going to disagree for legitimate reasons. And the more you try to curtail that, you get into problems. Last thing I'll say, lab leak. Lab leak is an example where you screwed up so badly. The society and science, we screwed it up. And I will tell you right now, I'm not an expert on the topic. I don't know if it was lab leak or not. If I had to bet, I'd make my bet. But, I don't know the answer. But what I will say, it is unconscionable that you could not discuss that for 4 months on Facebook. It is unconscionable that people labeled any discussion of the origin of the virus as quote unquote racist. It is unconscionable that we were unable to have that dialogue, and we needed Don McNeil and Nick Wade to write those Medium articles to unlock that discussion. That's unconscionable. That's untenable. A free society cannot have that level of restriction on speech. And so, you may have a system where you censor things that are incorrect, and you may correctly censor 999 out of 1,000 things. I don't think you're that good yet, but you even get to that rate. But that one thing that you're censoring inappropriately, that might be something super important that we need to flesh out as a society. So I think censoring science, it's a bad proposition. I don't think good things come from it, and I think that it reveals a lack of historical understanding of science and the way in which these debates have unfolded over many years. And I guess those are just some thoughts on this topic. If you like this video, this is what you get on this channel. Like, subscribe, leave a message, comment below, and until next time.